And it is another moment, ladies and gentlemen, for us to be together to continue to talk issues of global importance. And welcome to this edition of Global Insight on For You Media Africa. Today we are looking at the reforms calling from every angle, the voices of countries calling for the reforms of the United Nations Security Council, and we are looking at how Africa's voice has been resonated in present-day society. In the evolving landscape of global governance, Africa stands at a pivotal moment, voicing its demand for justice and equity through reforms to the United Nations Security Council, as articulated by Sierra Leone's President Julius Maada Bio during a historic debate on August 12, 2024. This moment signifies more than just a call for a representation that is Africa's representation, but it, however, embodies a decades-long struggle against historical injustices rooted in the legacies of colonialism and slavery, despite comprising a population that accounts for 28% of the UN membership and housing nearly half of the UN peacekeeping operations. Africa remains conspicuously absent from the permanent seat category, leading to glaring omission in global decision-making. The current configuration, according to report of the UN Security Council, reflects a post-World War II power structure that no longer aligns with contemporary geopolitical realities, necessitating urgent reforms tailored to enhance Africa's representation and other nations which are not already permanent members of the UN Security Council. However, the common African position encapsulated in the Azul-Winnie Consensus advocates for the allocation of 2 permanent and 2 non-permanent seats for African nations, asserting that Africa's participation is essential for achieving global security. The debate has garnered attention on the eve of the UN Summit of the Future, which is actually planned for September 2024, where calls for a reformed multilateralism will be further stressed or emphasized by the stakeholders. And of course, as the international community engages in discourse surrounding these reforms, several multilateral and of course geopolitical questions come to mind, prompting a reflection of Africa's role in global governance and peacekeeping effort, and also how the United Nations Security Council can undergo the real and practical reforms that will inculcate the changing dynamics of present-day society. You are most welcome, and this is Global Insight. Without much ado, we are going straight away to meeting our guest this day. And to South Africa, we want to acknowledge Professor GABILA NUBONG, political economist, and we'll be welcoming him already with a preamble or a holistic question on an overview of this decision re-echoed by the leadership of Sierra Leone, Julius Maada Bio, on the role of Africa at the UN Security Council. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks so much, Clarice. Good afternoon to you and to your viewers, and good afternoon to the my fellow panelists. It's an honor for me to be with you this afternoon on this conversation, and I look forward to a fruitful engagement we will be having.
Indeed, Professor NUBONG, thank you for honoring the invitation. Let's move to Moscow with to meet Patrick POPPEL, geopolitical analyst and expert at the Center for Geopolitical Studies, Belgrade, and he's from Serbia, to be precise. Hello and welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much. So yes, now I'm in Moscow, but I have a very wide view about what's happening in the world, and I'm an Austrian, but so I will explain in this conversation what is the view of Russia, of and of Austria and Europe about what's happening in the Security Council about Africa.
Absolutely. Africa resounding its voice, and other countries have been advocating for the same purpose. We'll be joined also by FIDEL AMAKYE OWUSU, international relations expert, security analyst from Ghana. If you're there, FIDEL, welcome to today's edition of the program. Okay, they'll be joining subsequently. Let me come to you. Before actually entering the analysis, let's listen to the president of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, highlighting some of the key points necessary for the reforms of the United Nations Security Council that will actually define Africa's position. I will join you right after that.
I'm pleased to deliver these initial remarks on behalf of the members of the African Union Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, namely Algeria, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, Libya, Namibia, Senegal, Uganda, Zambia, and my country, Sierra Leone. We are joined by A3+ members, Guyana and Mozambique. After nearly 80 years since the establishment of the United Nations and its Security Council, its imbalanced structure of bygone eras persists, undermining the legitimacy and effectiveness. It is therefore fundamentally important to address the issue of non-representation and underrepresentation of Africa in both the permanent and non-permanent categories of the Security Council, respectively. The current lack of representation in the permanent category does not reflect the current global landscape, and it is fundamental to consider the structural changes for its rectification. Additionally, it is significant to evaluate the Security Council's performance and legitimacy to ensure its effectiveness in addressing global challenges. It is deeply saddening to see the continued impact of historical injustice on Africa, and we must acknowledge and address these issues. Africa demands equitable representation in all UN decision-making organs, particularly the Security Council. By ensuring Africa's voice is heard, we can legitimize the UN's work and truly implement decisions that benefit the continent. Continuing this unfairness, we marginalize an entire continent that is highly important on the Security Council's agenda. Africa boasts a population of over 1.3 billion people, and its 54 countries represent about 28% of the total UN membership. Africa plays a significant role in peacekeeping and conflict resolution, yet it is vastly underrepresented. Therefore, our demand for 2 permanent seats with all the rights and prerogatives of current members and 2 additional non-permanent member seats is a matter of common justice that needs to be addressed. I'm therefore pleased that as coordinator of the C10, my country has sparked the first ever debate in the Security Council, occurring at a critical time on addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. This debate was essential to spotlight further the urgency of rectifying the historical injustice that has significantly hampered Africa's capability to contribute effectively to the global governance stage, on the global governance stage, and further engage in productive discussions in enhancing the Council's effectiveness and legitimacy. The C10 has demonstrated a strong commitment to addressing the historical injustice and inequality of the Security Council on Africa. The C10 will continue to amplify Africa's voice on this matter in advancing the common African position as outlined in the Ezowini Consensus and SAT Declaration. We are pleased to note that the common African position has received wide support within the reform process. I therefore register our profound thanks and appreciation to the member states, interest groups and regional groups for their continued and unwavering support for Africa and the common African position in the intergovernmental negotiations at the UN General Assembly.
President of Sierra Leone, coming straight away out to you, Professor NUBONG, like underlined earlier on, we want to look at the present status quo of the United Nations Security Council and how it is already challenging the changes or the existing political and geopolitical dispensation of the global world, particularly with Africa's voice resonated.
Well, Clarice, thanks so much for that question and for the opportunity to have participated in this debate. I'm not particularly sure what approach to what angle to tackle it on. So I would start from the very generic need for the reform of the UN systems and the Security Council to reflect the multipolarity of the world, to say that the world has significantly changed from what it was in 1945 at the end of the Second World War that led to the replacement of the League of Nations by the UN systems. And it's been a while. It's been 60 plus 80 odd years, if my calculation serves me right. And the world is in a different place. Just by virtue of those mere changes of time and the evolution of global geopolitics, the argument according to which the UN system is supposed to be reformed, I think it's absolutely valid, absolutely relevant, and timeless. Now, whether that's going to translate into a global consensus about how quickly these reforms need to take place is a different question. So, yes, I do. It's completely understandable that the African desk, with the 10 countries that signed up to that statement, also making reference to the Ezowini Consensus, should be pushing the interest of the African continent. And I think that it's the right thing to do, and I'm sure that there are other members of the Security Council and other parties outside of the continent that are sympathetic with that case for an African representation on the Security Council, or 2 permanent members and 2 non-permanent members. So it's a right call to make towards the charting of a global security system that is reflective of global reality. I, however, quickly need to add that in terms of the actual functioning of the real politique when it comes to the global geopolitics, it takes much more than the moral appeal for representation and the correction of a historical injustice for Africa to get what it wants. And I think that as Africans, we need to wake up to that realization of how the real world works. And in my sense, there's a sense of all the arguments. So just to put my comments in context, all the classical arguments that Africa uses to claim a position on the Security Council can be used by almost any other country in any other continent. Or use the demographic argument that speaks about our percentage representation in terms of global world population, that we are 1.2 billion out of 7 billion people, I mean, that's an argument that can easily be used by India, and it will be used by a single country in that context.
Yeah.
When we use the arguments about geographical representation on the continent, from a global scale, is an argument that could be brought by Australia, could be brought by any other Asian country. If you look at the current members of the permanent members of the Security Council, it's essentially Russia, China, US, UK, and France. So continental Europe, for example, post-Brexit has just one member. And there are very many other members of continental Europe that would also want to lay claim of a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Indeed.
So I do not say that to discount the African arguments, because these are relevant arguments and they are valid arguments. And for a more just and a more representative and a more democratic-looking UN system, it would be important that the proportionality of global representation from each continent be taken into account in the determination of the structure and the configuration of the Security Council. Unfortunately, neither the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN systems, nor the UN has functioned along the lines of democratic principles. It is global multilateralism that seeks to create a rules-based system according to which the affairs of the globe are supposed to be run. But at no point in human history have we had the emergence of a pure democratic style kind of global governance system. We are currently operating in the era of American exceptionalism, the old understanding that they are a benign force for good, and they are leading the pack in terms of determining good in the global order.
Yes.
And in the way the world has worked for the last 100 years, it would seem to me that it would take much more than a moral appeal argument to overtake that. Having said that, I think that there is still merits in pushing for a more democratic, a more representative kind of global order that takes into account where the world is going. I would conclude my comments and my remark by saying the following, specifically to the African actors and stakeholders and diplomats that are driving this agenda, to say that there's a lot of homework that we need to do at the level of the African continent to further strengthen the case. We have not gone past getting global consensus into determining how many seats we should get, but we have not finalized the internal conversation about what happens to those seats when they get allocated, which is an even bigger debate that needs to be sorted at the level of the African continent. And from my sense, according to the way the global world order works, I think our case is going to be strengthened if we do pursue a kind of economic prosperity that gives us a voice, so that we are not just a demographic, statistical mention in the conversation, but we are an economic force to be reckoned with. I think that's going to go a long way to strengthen our case about our voice and our presence in global politics. This will practically means that we need to increase our share of global trade, our share of global foreign direct investment, our share of the global participation in the global economy, including production value chains. And this is not something that is going to be given to us altruistically by the sudden change of part of the global system, because in the real world doesn't work like that. So to further strengthen our case, there's a certain kind of prosperity and emergence that we need to seek, get our act in order, attain a certain level of well-being and prosperity. And then when we speak in the global stage as an economic powerhouse, our voice is going to sound louder and we'll be able to persuade more people to look at our case. So those will be my remarks on that issue, Clarice. Let me hand it over back to you.
For the holistic insight, Professor NUBONG. First thing first, and of course you quite mentioned other areas of that the African Union can already be deliberating on to see that when the voice is given or the position is given, it should be handled accordingly. Coming to you, Patrick POPPEL, we are still in the overview of the United Security Council. one of the strongest organs of the United Nations General Assembly that advocates for peace and security across the global world. The call for its reform is not only coming from Africa, but other nations across the global world have actually been sending their voices to see these reforms that will meet the present changes in the global world holistically. As a geopolitical analyst, what do you allude to this call, which has intensified in today's world and is coming ahead of the United Nations General Assembly?
So I think that the biggest problem on the beginning was at the beginning of the United States when they are considered. This is an organization for the biggest mighties, for the big countries, for the nuclear powers now also, yes. So this is the reason why they have a seat in the Security Council. But now we are living in a world, everything is changing. And so the little countries, the not well-developed countries, but they are now have this development. This is very important. And we can expect this. They like to have also a voice in this structure. But I like to explain my perspective about this. I think this old structure of the United Nations, these old structures, in one example are the United Nations. I call them the United States because they don't care about the nations, the reality. We can see this in the past, what's happened. They are only the United States, not the United Nations. This is a big problem. It's a very big problem. The influence of the United States and other big powers. And so the smaller countries have no possibility to have the voice in this auditory. And we must change this. And how we can change this? Yes, one possibility is what's happened now. The different countries, first the countries in Africa, because they are like to have justice after these years of prosecution. And they also have seen that the United Nations don't like to solve problems. Many of the structures, they only make problems. We can see first this problem in Africa. One example is Somalia, maybe. Yes, you can see it was also, there's no solution for Somalia in the program of the United Nations. Why? Because the United States are on the top of the United Nations. This is a big problem. But this is the one possibility to change something, to have more auditory and to have a voice in this auditory. This is one possibility inside the structures of the United Nations. The other possibility, and this is my perspective, is to see to the other structures. First, in the way of security, in case of security. So we have the Shanghai Cooperation. We have now BRICS, and maybe BRICS get also some tasks about global security, not only economical. So I think it's very important for the African countries also to have more integration in BRICS, and maybe also, if it's the wish of the members, in this Shanghai Security Cooperation. I think this is more interesting for the African countries, first for the smaller countries, then to have more and more voice inside the United Nations, because this is a very old structure, and this is very difficult to change something there.
For that, Patrick, let me stay with you and looking at this question, following what you just said. Now, we are looking at how this, all the changes can affect policy making. So let's look at the significance of Africa's underrepresentation at the UN Security Council, and how it is already, affecting negatively the African continent, and why it is pressing for stakeholders to look into to the plea and make the scope very favorable for policy making, especially on global issues that pertains to the future of Africa?
This is it is a very big problem now that we have too much interest in Africa, and also these figures, these people will like to have some influence there, or also the statesmen of the different countries. They are now in a fight about about who is the real government in Africa, and this is the greatest question. And so they are. The perspective is very bad, I think. So I think when I can say my opinion openly here, I think I have. I'm very sorry, but I think that we can have big troubles in Africa about this fight, and so I think everything depends on the development of Africa now, not on different advances in political on political level. First, on the development of Africa, because they are now in a situation only like a carrier of raw material, and this is the problem. When they have more development, they have more possibilities. This is how every strategic question is answered.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, that you're on Global Insight. This moment, if you're still there, Professor NUBONG, we want to highlight some of these historical injustices which the leadership of Sierra Leone, highlighted while addressing the Council. So in what ways can the historical marginalization of Africa within the UN Security Council be addressed in today's society to rectify these injustices that stem from colonialism, and how might this influence contemporary global governance structure? Professor NUBONG? Please, can you unmute your mic? We can't hear you. Okay, while we're waiting for Professor NUBONG to rejoin, we continue to analyze the stakes surrounding the call for the reform of the United Nations Security Council. I want to highlight here that even the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has joined his voice to the voice of African leaders, and even the Russian Federation, among other countries, have been making clarion calls for these reforms. And the major questions that we're asking is if actually the Security Council or the United Nations General Assembly can review the call by countries for the abolition of the veto. We heard Julius Madabio saying that should the United Nations Security Council decide to maintain the veto, it should be granted to all, or either it should be abolished. And those are some of the complexities of the reforms of the United Nations Security Council. I will come back to you, Patrick POPPEL, on this issue. I quite mentioned that Russia, especially through its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been voicing out the representation of Africa and even some Latin American countries and countries of the global south as as a whole in the UN Security Council, given that the present, crisis which are affecting countries, particularly in the Middle East, we have Sudan and other countries in Africa and elsewhere that needs practical decisions to be taken at the level of the Security Council. But then the fact that there have no voting rights is already a limitation. So what can you, advocate as per a solution towards, reviewing the status quo of the non-permanent members of the Security Council in resolving world's, interconnected crisis?
So I think this what we have seen now is very important, so that Russia and also other countries are the partners of Africa. This is very important to see this. Second is this: we must see that this old structure, because every time we talk about permanent and no permanent, so we can see the United Nations has a big problem in the structure. Yes, because somebody should tell me why has French a permanent seat in the Security Council and not maybe, for example, South Africa. Yes, so because this is an old structure, and I think we need a big reform, a very huge reform we need before we can advance some good steps in the direction of justice in these circles, in this auditory. So the whole structure of the United Nations need a reform, and first the Security Council. And I think it will become the time that somebody will call to do this. Maybe Russia together with China, I don't know. But I think it's not justice to have only this very small group of permanent members and so permanent seats. Yes, this is not justice in the world, and so the world is changing, and we must react about this. And the only possibility is reform these structures.
Welcome, Priestley EKANE, international relations expert. You're welcome to Global Insight, to the Mr. EKANE, and we want to analyze the stakes of Africa's representation at the United Nations Security Council. What is your take, especially on the outing of the president of Sierra Leone, Julius Maada Bio, calling for the Africa's representation, and saying that Africa should be given 2 permanent seats and 2 non-permanent seats at the UN Security Council, given Africa's role at the Council on issues of security and peace?
Thank you for having me on your program today. And thank you for bringing on quite an interesting topic as the one we have. Quite a compelling topic too. What we know the gameplay that's currently going on in world affairs today. It is quite a pity that a topic like this has to always be recurrent, especially within the circles of international relations analysis, and when we take a glance at the evolvement of global affairs, it is worth questioning and even quite disturbing why Africa as a continent would not have a place, a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council when we get to the understanding or when we get to the facts that Africa is a turning point in international relations issues, and Africa cannot be, after 60 years of independence, beyond be considered only as a subject of international relations, not as considered, my pardon, as an object of international relations, not as a subject of, well, in fact, that's what it is, because, and if we look at integrationist groups, like we have so many within the sub-Saharan Africa and Africa in general, and then we have other diplomatic groups, as like the the group with Brazil, South Africa, BRICS, and we cannot imagine how South Africa, for example, would be in an integrationist diplomatic group like the BRICS, and not find itself in maybe on the table of decision making within the United Nations. Of course, people might want to advance the point that Africa is riddled with conflicts, with wars. But again, we know the source of these conflicts, we know the source of these wars. But of course, the measuring glass of obtaining a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, it's not clearly defined, because we know countries in that close circle who are not, for example, doing economically good, but then they are on the table, they sit on the tables of global decisions. We know countries who are engaged in warmongering, yet they take decisions when it comes to shaping global affairs. And then you cannot understand a continent like Africa, which is the bastion of human resources, the bastion of natural resources, and which, of course, is doing economically good. When you take examples, individual examples like Nigeria, like South Africa, like Rwanda, like Ghana, like Senegal. I mean, there are a lot of these examples in East Africa, in West Africa, where we're experiencing a blooming economic growth. There are lots of parts in Africa where we talk about economic stability. We talk about stability in terms of security, and that's for one. But then when you take Africa as a continental grouping, it's the only continent where you find all its member states belonging to an organization, and that you cannot understand how a grouping of 53 nations cannot project their voice on the international scene and in a concert as the United Nations, and they pay their dues in this organization. They attend United Nations General Assemblies. It's high time the people of Africa understand that we cannot occupy the back seats of global discourse, that we cannot be the hand clappers in the concert of decision making, but that we have the edge. We have what it takes, to sit on tables of decision and actually shape world affairs.
For staying with you, Mr. EKANE, while highlighting, of course, the importance of Africa on the global or at the global stage, I want us to look at this. Today, we see that geopolitical contestation is one of the reasons. You see some turbulence across the African continent, and we also see how this is affecting the continent's voice in this era of multilateralism. Now, let's try to understand the current, membership decision-making process at the United Nations and see how this is already an impediment for Africa and other countries which that do not have a voting right at the Security Council, and especially on issues which you mentioned that concerns the continent as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. We cannot make the excuse of insecurity in Africa, in many parts of Africa. We cannot take it as an excuse for not accessing the closed doors of the Security Council of the United Nations. Because if we look at the global configuration, the conflictual map of the world, when you take countries of the Middle East, for example, when you analyze the current conflict between Israel and the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, when you take the war in Ukraine, in fact, every continent, so to say, faces a kind of conflict, ranging from military to security threats. But then, when you look at the actors that make up the Security Council, and you look at the shaping of decisions, because actually, it's important to note that the Security Council is a decision-shaping body who have the power, the right to veto, and that we have, based on their bilateral ties with certain countries, meting out certain decisions, taking sanctions towards certain countries, comes with a certain sense of bias. You cannot understand, for example, why a country like Israel feels comfortable in committing excesses and then goes unpunished. And then you find countries, for example, like Libya, on whom like the Libyan guy Muammar Gaddafi, who was ousted from power because of as they would say, his authoritarian or totalitarian regime. And then you have other countries like in the West who actually practice authoritarian leaderships. So you see, it's not an objective body. So we cannot entrust the powers, the decision making, the decision shaping of global affairs to a very restricted number of countries who can wake up today and say, okay, we are taking on Mali, we are taking on South Africa, we are taking on Libya, and then on the other hand, are slow to take certain decisions on Ukraine, on Russia, on Israel, and a lot of those examples. So for me, I would say that advancing the cards of insecurity in Africa as the reason why Africa does not have a representation in the United Nations Security Council, so it would be too lame, because you can't downplay Africa's economic power. You can't downplay Africa's human resources. You can't downplay the movers and the doers of the continent. Like we said, we've seen a country like Rwanda, who, just 20 years ago was deeply involved in a civil war, a genocide, and 20 years after, or 24 years after, is, it's an example of growth, of progress in multi-dimensional fields. You can't take a country like Nigeria, who has, I think, the 9th petroleum reserve in the world, and then you just dismiss their economic strength. You can't take you can't take for granted examples like Algeria, South Africa. Put together these 54, 53 countries, I think it would be a legitimate claim. It would be a legitimate claim to seek for a place in the United Nations Security Council, especially as within sub-regional groupings, Africa is well involved in decisions that shape the world. I took the example of South Africa being part of the BRICS. So there is no excuse why there is no legitimate excuse as to why Africa would not have a place on the table of the Security Council. The United Nations Security
Council. In a multipolar world, it is imperative that each stakeholder redefines or defines its agenda that will see total collaboration in full respect of sovereignty of every nation to boost international cooperation and even the philosophy of globalization. Thank you, EKANE. Now, coming back to you, Patrick Poppel, maybe you want to look at the call by African nations for the abolition of the veto, knowing fully well that the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council have this veto power that permits them to, override decisions which are not binding. So what concerns do you foresee from current permanent members regarding the potential for reform and how this might influence the outcome? Patrick Poppel? While waiting for that, I will take this opportunity for us to listen to the excerpts of the United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres, who re-echoed the voice of African heads of state on the position of Africa at the UN Security Council, outlining that the current status quo of the UN Security Council is actually outdated as it was created after the Second World War. That was in 1945, and with the major changes which are occurring at the global level and even emerging parts, it is already bringing some discrepancies at the level of the preamble of the Security Council, one major organ of the United Nations General Assembly. We invite you all to listen to this excerpt of Antonio Guterres, and I will join you right after.
Colonial rule and had no voice in international affairs. This created a glaring omission that has remained unresolved until now. There is no permanent member representing Africa in the Security Council, and the number of elected members from the continent is not in proportion to its importance. We cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people.
This South African academic in international relations argued that
Chief, let me come back to you, EKANE. Of course, looking at the call from Sierra Leonean leader for the abolition of the veto power, do you see the feasibility of this, and how do you think the already permanent members, Russia, China, the United States, and of course Britain, will react, or their reactions towards this call for the abolition of the veto power?
There would be Of course, there would be resistance to such a call because alliances are built both on a bilateral level and on a multilateral level. So we would not expect that it would be it would be a given. But again, I think there is a need to exert diplomatic power. There is a need to have a shared voice as to the current demand of the Sierra Leone government requesting for Africa for the abolition of the veto power, because in essence, it is mostly caused untold conflict around the world. It has affected peace deals around the world. It is extended conflicts in parts around the world, because most of the times the decision to place a veto in a conflictual area, or during conventional wars, or during blown out violence, is because of alliances created by these members of the United Nations Security Councils and members who are not necessarily in the Security Council. For example, you can, for example, the United States in the current conflict, the enduring conflict between Israel and Gaza, there's been many administrations, U.S. administrations, that have always vehemently condemned the violent exactions of Israel. But on the Security Council level, that's a similar voice would not be projected by countries like U.S., countries like Britain, countries like France, countries like Germany, on a simple premise that they build old-time alliances, historical alliances with Israel, and you would find an enduring war like the Israeli-Palestinian war for many years, because certain decisions that cannot be taken within the United Nations Security Council to punish the warring parties, in this case, for example, Israel. And on the contrary, and then on the other side, you would have countries that do not have these sufficient strong alliances, and whose leaders would be whisked away in the morning, as in the case of Iraq with Saddam Hussein, or in the case of Libya with Mohammed Gaddafi. And this, of course, should be, I think, should be Africa's baton cry. It should be their baton cry, because you cannot. I always say it's a thing of putting the horse before the cart. I think the idea here, if you would ask my opinion, I always say that there is a strong need to build a strong continental grouping with a shared voice. That's the African Union, because, of course, when these members of the Security Council, for example, decide to wage a war, in the case, for example, like Libya, we're talking about sovereign states. You cannot understand how a diplomatic group like the AU would step aside and watch watch NATO and a few countries team together and whisk away a leader. There is a big problem. You would not understand, for example, how Kagame, with everything he's doing in Rwanda, you wake up one morning and then there's a tag on Kagame as being a dictator. And then you find the deafening silence of 54 member countries. And then the next day, you hear missiles in Rwanda, for example, and then you ask yourself a question: how comes 54 heads of states with leading sovereign nations would allow one of theirs being whisked away? And today, for example, you have the projecting voice of Sierra Leone, but it is sad to notice that there are no additional voices. I mean, not yet. We would expect other heads of states from West Africa, from East Africa, and other parts of Africa to weigh in their voice at this moment, to seek what is theirs, and asking and demanding for a place in the United Nations Security Council.
Mr. EKANE, and a lot that has to be done at the level of the African Union, because President Mother Bio highlighted that even though they are calling for 2 permanent seats at the UN Security Council and even 2 non-permanent seats, that it's actually a greater task for the African Union to discuss the modalities and to see how this will be implemented in the coming times or the impending time. But now, what is the feasibility of this, given that there are still calls for reforms at the level of the African Union to be able to have a solid standing on global issues that will protect, like you have highlighted, Mr. EKANE, the sovereignty and of African nations. We just joined by FIDEL OWUSU, who is also an international relations expert. You are welcome to the program. I was about to highlight the issue of inclusivity and representation, and what potential model for reform could ensure more inclusive representations from emerging powers, especially across the African continent and smaller nations at the UN Security Council. To you, FIDEL also.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clarice. Sorry for the late, there was miscommunication. That was just by the way. Firstly, I would say that the architecture, the global architecture as we have it now, the UN system, is currently based on the victors of the Second World War. Those, if this has not already been mentioned, I would like to repeat that those who won the Second World War were the ones who got to be veto powers, or who got the veto seat or the permanent seat on the Security Council. And so after 70 years, that system, we can say, is obsolete or archaic. The global system has changed. Populations have changed. We've had economies growing, and we've had interest being more. We've currently had a more multipolar world that needs power to be redistributed. We cannot stick to the post-Second World War system to today. And so what I would say is that Africa, first of all, has to decide. There's already contention over who is qualified to sit in the seat, or if the UN is going to be reformed for more seats to be added to its the permanent seat of the Security Council. Which countries are going to be qualified? Nigeria has been mentioned, South Africa has been mentioned, Egypt has been mentioned, as well as Ethiopia. In other discussions, we've heard countries like Algeria and Morocco also being mentioned. But the most dominant 3 has been South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. Now, South Africa, because it has the most industrialized system in the continent, and the system is quite advanced in terms of manufacturing and other things. Nigeria, because currently it has the largest economy, it has the largest population, and in terms of Sub-Saharan Africa, it is very consequential. In Egypt, we have the most powerful military on the continent in Egypt. And also, Egypt is also seen as, if Egypt is chosen, then the Middle East, which is also fighting for a permanent seat in the Security Council, would be represented, because Egypt is also considered as a Middle Eastern country. So you put all this together and you realize that even if the number of seats on the Security Council are going to be increased, it will take a lot of debate to decide on who is going to occupy these or those seats, whether it's going to be 1 or 2. And that in itself is a problem. This shows that as a continent, we've not done enough to hold internal discussions as to the way forward. And I think that Africa should rather focus on building its internal structures at the AU level, as the last speaker said. At the AU level, are we that consequential? Are we able to build that common front in engaging the rest of the world? Are we able to solve our own security issues? We also have a Security Council in the AU system. How has that been? So we must get things right on the continent. And I think that when we get things right on the continent, some of these things will fall in place, because then many people feel that the UN system, we have conservatives who feel that the UN system should be kept as it is, because if the system has been able to withstand the test of time, then there's no need to change or to fix what is not broken. But all you know, we all know that the world is shifting. So for me, I think that in principle, Africa needs some representation there, both permanent and non-permanent membership. However, I think that we must get our act right before we proceed with this. Thank you.
Fidel, I will share for the promise, and of course, I will stay with you if you actually are still available. From what you've said, the underlying factor now, the point is at the level of the African continent or the African Union. And you know, what do you think now that you have highlighted the lapses of the African Union that could even mar the Africa's position at the United Nations Security Council if granted a permanent seat? What parameters do you propose as you know, solutions to already anticipating on how to you know, utilize the opportunity at the UN Security Council at the international level for proper intercession in global governance and decision making?
Yeah. So firstly, I would say that first of all, the neutrality of Africa is currently in question. Now, African countries are either tilting towards the west or the east. Now, if you have that division, or if you have countries that are openly biased towards one of these international centers of power, then it means that if you are chosen or you are made to sit in the Security Council, you are likely to toe the line of the country you are tilted to currently. So many countries on the Security Council are going to be seeing you to be not to be fair. And so if you have veto power, it means that you can veto any substantive issue on the Security Council. So the question is, if you are not neutral today, then it means that your seat could be predictable. Like people can say that, well, if this country or maybe South Africa is going to sit in the Security Council, looking at its current position in the Russian-Ukraine war, it is likely to support Russia. Someone can also say that Nigeria has been very close to the United States. And so looking at its position currently, it is likely to support the US at the Security Council if it's given a permanent seat. All these things need to be addressed. And in fact, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, said that Ghana was not looking right, neither was it looking left, it was looking forward. That is what Africa must do, so that the seat that we are going to seek will be wet-edged. Other than that, we may get a seat, but it may be serving outside interest rather than the interest of the people of Africa. But to the point I mentioned earlier, what I'm trying to say is that the conflicts in the DRC, the conflict in the Horn of Africa, those conflicts in the Sahel, terrorism, extremism, hunger, socioeconomic problems, Africa must be up and doing in solving it. Those countries that want to have their permanent seat to represent Africa in the Security Council should take the lead in making sure that most of these domestic problems are resolved. Say, taking a seat in the Security Council should not be an end in itself. It should be a means to an end. And that, what means is it a means to get the power in order to solve a problem. But you must be seen that you have that efficacy to solve the problem before you are given the seat. And so we have to tackle all these problems. And we must not, because it's Security Council, when you mention Security Council, people think it should be about hard qualities or hard power, naked use of force. No, you must also solve socioeconomic problems. The hunger issues in Africa, the social issues, the human rights issues. Women are now caught up in conflict and their lives are being devastated. We must solve that before we can have that kind of merit to sit on the Security Council. The Security Council is not a perfect forum, but we can make it perfect, or we can make it better if we go there on the right note or with the right preparation. And there's a saying that you can only progress when opportunity meets preparation. Because then if you are not prepared, the opportunity may come, but you cannot use it for progressive means or for development. And so we must get these kind of issues right. And then when we sit in New York, Turtle Bay, anything that we do over there will then have the consequences. Currently, you may admit with me that, or you may admit that the issue of global politics or great power politics has caught up with Africa. The continent is being divided between the West and East. We have a multipolar world where other middle powers like Turkey, Israel, and others are also getting in to push their own interests or push their individual interests. Now, what must Africa do? What we need to do is to be able to position ourselves such that we will have original policies that is African-centered, by Africans, made by Africans, and for Africans. And when we do that, and we are sitting on the Security Council, it will become consequential to the common people like myself, who will then look up to our seat in the Security Council to protect the interests of Africans. Thank you very much.
About protecting the interest of Africa and Africans, and trying to review the historical injustices committed against the African continent, and for the fact that since the creation of the UN Security Council, Africa's voice has been echoed by former colonial masters, but then we are in a different dispensation, the 21st century, of great strides which have been recorded across the African continent, and we hear this resounding voice using the voice of the Sierra Leonean President Julius Maada Bio on the call for Africa's full representation. Now, this is where the problematic lies, and I will be channeling the question to you, Mr. EKANE. Let's look at the present power dynamics in Africa and how this will affect Africa's standing at the United Nations Security Council should the veto be granted to Africa. And if this is a potential obstacles as a international relations expert, understanding the role of countries' agenda in advocating for their own position at the global level, what do you think are those practical tools that can occupy Africa's foreign policy in line with decision making at the UN Security Council?
Once more, I like to think that one of the biggest problems of Africa is clearly defining its the different integrationist paradigms that we have on the continent, whether it's the CEMAC or the SADC or the ECOWAS. We talk about the movements of goods and services, the free movements of people, and so forth and so on. I think a clear definition of the policies that shape this regional groupings is still a hard nut to crack, and this failure has its repercussions on the bigger body like the AU, because of course we before being members of this sub-regional groupings, these countries are first and foremost sovereign states that have wielded some of their powers in these organizations that they freely join. But I think the big problem within the AU today is the governing structure of the AU, wherein there has not been a clear foreign policy particular to the African Union. We might engage in bilateral agreements individually as states and as sub-regional groupings. We might engage in economic cooperations individually as states or sub-regional groupings. But when we come in a circle as the African Union, we need to get to a point where there is a clear foreign policy defined, where there is an economic policy defined, where there is a social policy defined. When we don't have these three tenets, it becomes difficult to lead an organization as the AU. And that is why today the AU is such, of course, it's a well-structured, it's an organization with a well-structured organigram, but in dispensing its missions and its visions, it's still a big problem, because like I said earlier, you cannot understand why a grouping as the AU cannot have a shared voice. We might consider this term quite trivial when we say shared voice, but it has an incontainable role to play in terms of projecting a certain diplomatic voice. And if we are not able to build a common security structure, a common economic structure, a common diplomatic voice, a common social structure, then projecting a voice or seeking a position in the United Nations Security Council becomes a big problem. Then again, we fall on the point. I remember some years ago that the question of a shared African language common to the Africans was a big problem, where sometimes it was on the table as whether Swahili or Lingala or Douala should be a common African language. The idea of a common currency was a problem. The idea of a common diplomatic voice was a problem. So I say again that one of the big problems Africa is being confronted to in the 21st century is not the absence of its institutions, because when you look, again, I repeat, when you look at the organigram of the AU, it is so well structured. But then in dispensing its regalian missions, that's where the problem is. Because, for example, we cannot come to terms, for example, that South Africa, in fact, it's economically buoyant. We cannot come to terms, for example, if we say two positions would be given now to Africa in the United Nations Security Council, there would be a fiery debate as to who is deserving of that position. There would be constant backstabbing. There would be. But then there is a measuring glass as to the progress of individual countries on the continent. For example, today when we look at West Africa, it's no denying that Ghana, even with its own different ills, has experienced a progressive and enviable democracy. When we look at Senegal has experienced a progressive, enviable democracy. In democracy, of course, in Western definition terms. When we look at other countries like Nigeria, we would say the same. But today, I say it, I keep saying it's like putting the cart before the claim is legitimate, asking for after 60 years of independence of many of these African countries, asking for a seat in the United Nations Security Council. That's quite legitimate, but you have to fix your backyard before you come to the fore. You don't go to the fore and making claims when there is still a lot to be fixed. So I think first it would do a lot of service to the African people, to strengthen the African Union as a continental body, to get to a point where you have men who in the heat of crisis in Mali, in the heat of crisis in Nigeria, in the heat of crisis in Cameroon, could take a flight and land in one of these capitals and say no, and actually have a high-level meeting to seek solutions, and not always wait for Russia to provide military aid, or not having anything to say when France would, for example, put an end to its, or Mali would put an end to its diplomatic relations with France and everything. It should be the common aspirations of the people, and it should be a common voice of the people. So I still maintain the point that yes, we are entitled to a place in the Security Council, but when that time comes, we should be ready. We should be ready to embrace such a seat. And again, as the other panelist said, he said, today we have a continent with broken voices, you know, with broken voices, others pledging allegiance to Russia, others pledging allegiance to Great Britain and France or the US, and that in the United Nations Security Council, such allegiances shall be, could be a problematic. No, I would say international relations, of course, is a game of interest, but at some point it's also a combination of soft power and hard power to give real politics, because it's an open secret to everyone. It's an open secret to everyone to know that US, Britain, France, Germany, till thy kingdom come, will place their allegiance on Israel. It's known to everybody that when South Africa cries, Russia will come calling. So we at some point in international relations, yes, we want a place in the Security Council, but we also want a place where we do hard politics, where at some point Africa says no. We put our veto, and no, you will not pick up the president of Mali. You will not pick up the president of Cameroon. You will not pick up the president of Nigeria, because we have a power of veto. So we have to get to this point where we should be able to practice this high politics, because the United Nations is the place par excellence for hardest politics, whether soft power, whether hard power, or just real politics. So it's time to stop always making excuses for being in the backyard and come to the fore and project our voices. But that voice should start, the projection of such a voice should start already within our own, first of all, regional structures and then continental structures.
EKANE. Now, let me come back to you, Fidel. You quite mentioned the fear that if Africa is given that permanent seat at the UN Security Council, there is already the disparity between the East and the West, where other countries that align with the philosophy of the West will actually vote for, and those aligning with the philosophy of the East will vote for the East when it comes to decision making at the Security Council. Now, is Africa not, let's look at the role of leaders in the present dispensation, where you see the wind of change actually is blowing across, and we're looking at Africa Renaissance. Do you think political leaders will lack the political will and the diplomacy, like you highlighted and also EKANE highlighted, diplomacy that can make a clear African agenda? The African Union Commission Chief Musa Faki Mahamat actually highlighted, and we are aware that the AUC is one organ of the African Union that is actually very involved in monitoring the changes at the international level. The political leaders to not, ready enough to apply this soft and hard power to be able to define Africa's agenda at the global level, given that the continent, though it is richly blessed in mineral and even the human capital, cannot function in silos. Go on.
Yeah, I think my co-panelist is not around. That's a very, very, very interesting question. I think the need for
Definitely, we apologize for that interruption, hoping that all is getting us set. I want to just take this opportunity to reiterate to our millions of viewers out there that this is the platform Global Insight on the Pan-African Television for You Media Africa. We continue to analyze the stakes pertinent to the continent Africa. The call for reforms at the UN Security Council have intensified in the present day society, where the international world has witnessed some, changing power dynamics and emerging global powers, which has opened the scope for the continent Africa to understand the practicality of the structurization of, or maybe how the world is being structured, and Africa is resounding its own voice. It's not today, it has been going on for decades, that under a committee of 10, African head of states have been advocating for the position or the permanent seat at the UN Security Council, and even the increase of number of non-permanent members at the council to be able to make a louder or a greater voice for Africa at the Security Council on decisions pertaining to peace and security. Now, if everything is okay, coming back to you, EKANE, we are looking at the current diplomacy of Africa, and asking if African leaders still lack the political will to see how they can deal with or align with the East and the West with the purpose of advocating Africa's common agenda.
Yeah, thank you once more. I think the political will is quite the problem here, because we have the demography. I mean, we have the demography. We're the only continent of over 1 billion people. We have a buoyant youth. We have the institutions. I think the problem with Africa today is leans mostly on its leadership and the decision to will certain powers on a bigger structure that we all decide to be part of. And I say interdependence, multidimensional interdependence is very important in order to build a strong front and in order to build a strong voice that can be projected diplomatically. For example, we need to put our security intelligence together. We need to think economically together. We need to think politically together.
Indeed.
And in essence, just build a structure that is able, because when we're able to do that, we are able to share intelligence in the domain of security, or we are able to share intelligence in the domain of finance. Because, for example, in the United Nations Security Council, as with 5 members, when a decision must be taken, this decision is based on historical reasons, on geopolitical reasons, on security reasons. It's not a decision that's taken on the whims or out of whims or out of caprices. Yeah. It's a decision that reflects the aspirations of a people, the thoughts of a people. When you take, for example, the war going on in Israel versus Palestine, and you come to a country like Germany, where I am, it is ingrained in the minds of a lot of Germans that Israel is an ally. I mean, it is ingrained. Like, if you walk on the streets, the average German knows that Israel is our ally. They know that. And then you will not find them in discussions where they would give validation to a country like to Palestine. No, because of historical reasons. Like we know, the Shoah, as it happened here in the Nazi Germany, it's built a certain compassion for the people of Israel.
Yeah.
In Germany, and there is no, the decisions taken by France in the Security Council would reflect the thoughts of Germany, would reflect the original partnerships within in the EU.
Yeah.
For example, you cannot, when America wants to take a decision in the Security Council, they will be mindful of what of the stakes involved for a country like Canada. When Russia would want to take a decision, they would at some point consider Brazil, they would consider China, they would consider South Africa. What do these countries that make up our sub-regional grouping or our diplomatic grouping stand to lose or stand to gain in this decision I'm taking in the Security Council? That's why I say the members of the United Nations Security Council, you know, they carry the voice of a people based on security reasons, based on historical ties, based on socio-economic ties. So all of this is put together in order to take a certain decisions against or for a state, or to take a certain decisions in a conflict situation. So it is, and that's why I say it is so simplistic, you know, to cry. And I am a little tired of seeing this Africa constantly adopting the posture of a crying baby. You know, I say we are not objects of international relations. 60 years after independence, we are subjects of international relations. And we are not begging for favors. We deserve favors because we feed the world. We feed the world. We have the raw natural resources. It's not about the billions of the dollar bills printed in banks or euro bills printed in banks. That's not the measurement of wealth. The measurement of wealth is natural resources.
Indeed.
And we have it on our subsoils. We have it on our subsoils, and we must be able to know what we are worth. We must have a historical conscience. We must be able to reappropriate ourselves of our history, where we come from, reclaim all this, what makes us as a people. We must understand that we are the only continent with a youthful population yearning and burning. We are movers, we are doers. I gave an example of Rwanda. Just 24 years ago, that was a country, you know, dusted in the ashes, dusted by an untold genocide, you know, ripped of its own future and unable to take a flight of his future, or a rip of his past and unable to take a flight of his future. But they rose from their dust, you know, they dusted themselves up, and today it's an enviable country in the domain of IT, in the domain of technology, in the domain of services. They're doing well for themselves. Okay. Yeah, and we have those examples. They are legends, and we can do. I think we can tap from this individual success stories all around the continent. And before even asking for a place in the Security Council, we should do our homework. We should do our homework. We should be able at a point in time come to a consensus and, you know, convince ourselves that if tomorrow the United Nations Security Council would want to sit and they say, okay, Africa, we are ready for you, we should be ready too.
Absolutely.
You know, if they say if they say we are ready for you for two seats in the Security Council, we should be able to say Nigeria and South Africa. We should be able to say Morocco and Cameroon. We should be able to say that. You know, we do not go to other back meetings and being so uncertain about our future to engage the world in a certain kind of legitimacy.
Absolutely.
So I think our homework needs to be done.
Indeed, our homework needs to be done, EKANE, to be done by both the political leaders, civil society, and every African at every level to ensure that with the new world order, the Africa we want can actually come to the fore. We continue to analyze, of course, in our subsequent editions, we are going to continue analyzing ways practical towards the real emancipation of Africa in every dimension of it. I wish to take this opportunity to thank you, gentlemen, for the great insight on the topic, for the acknowledging, of course, the need for Africa's permanent representation at the United Nations Security Council, and also challenging African stakeholders, particularly the political stakeholders, to be more intentional in solving internal problems so as to, greatly utilize the scope for dispensation at the decision-making table of the UN Security Council. I want to thank you to the technicians, of course, for ensuring that the program was a success. Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to know that you have trusted the Pan-African Television. It is on this note that I'll be drawing the curtains into today's edition of Global Insight, but that's not all. You keep having a lovely moment in the company of programs on For You Media Africa. And always have in mind, it is another view of the world. Bye-bye and stay blessed.